I'm Yoel Finkelman, the curator of the Judaica collection at the National Library, and very, very proud that we have come this far in creating these exhibits and this conference. And I'm particularly excited about this session because it starts to address the questions that every student of philosophy has asked, especially or been asked by non-students of philosophy, which is, who cares? Why does any of this stuff matter? What difference does it make? And you don't really have to be Leo Strauss to realize that Rambam is interested in the way in which philosophy matters to society, to the individual, to the household, to governance, and that philosophy is not just an abstract way of addressing certain kinds of abstract questions, but is actually a search for the proper way to live in light of truth, and that he's deeply aware of the fact that the way in which philosophy impacts life is dependent to a very great degree and is impacted to a great degree by the state of culture and by the state of politics. And then that introduces a whole other set of questions, which is how, as intellectuals, how as students of philosophy, are we able to address the question of philosophy and life in a responsible way? How, as scholars, can we look back at the past and not simply impose our own ethical or political interests on the past, but actually to learn from the past and to teach us wisdom about how to live? And the great thing about the two panelists today, both Carlos Fraenkel, the speaker, and Menachem Lorberbaum, the respondent, is that they're really examples of how to do that responsibly. How to be learned, how to read texts responsibly, and then ultimately address questions cautiously about life today. Carlos Fraenkel is a professor of philosophy and Jewish studies at McGill University. He wrote, based on his dissertation, an important work on Shmuel ibn Tibon and his commentary on Moreh Nevuchim, on the place of another book on philosophical religion, from Plato to Spinoza, and finally a work that's much closer, and which actually, as I was preparing to be the chair of this session, I said I was going to read that when it came out and haven't done so, so I quickly ordered it, and hopefully I'll get to it this weekend, but which really touches on what it means to be an intellectual in the real world. We're going to organize this session with Professor Fraenkel. I will introduce afterwards Professor Lorberbaum, who will speak, and then hopefully we will open up the floor for responses.
Okay, thank you for the generous introduction. The title of the last book, by the way, if you also want to order it, is Teaching Plato in Palestine, Philosophy in a Divided World. I think you forgot to mention the title. It's still available. אני קודם כל מתנצל שאני לא אתן את ההרצאה בעברית, יש לי קצת ייסורי מצפון, אבל פשוט זה העניין של זמן, אז זה יהיה באמת באנגלית. So philosophy as a way of life. Does Maimonides consider philosophy as a way of life? In some sense, you know, this could be a very short lecture because the answer is, of course he does. According to Maimonides, we achieve perfection and happiness through what he calls the intellectual love of God. And what does it mean to intellectually love God? It means to study the philosophical sciences, starting with logic, which is a toolkit of the philosopher, and then mathematics. You have to sharpen your mind, and then you go to physics and metaphysics. So physics for Maimonides is a study of how God's wisdom is manifest in the causal order of nature, and metaphysics is a study of the immaterial causes of the natural order, culminating, of course, in God, who is the first cause of everything. Deuteronomy 6:5, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, is for Maimonides a call, I quote, to acquire all the correct opinions concerning the whole of being, opinions that constitute the numerous kinds of all the theoretical sciences. So these are the sciences that I just mentioned, from logic all the way to metaphysics, the theoretical sciences, through which the opinions forming the ultimate end are validated. end of quote. This is Guide 3, chapter 28. So we are commanded to love God, which means attaining knowledge of the whole of being, no less. And this is what, according to Maimonides, constitutes our ultimate end. This constitutes human perfection, the human good, this kind of knowledge of the whole of being. Now, intellectual perfection for Maimonides is not only the goal of a philosophical life, but it is also the goal of a Jewish life, right? So Maimonides identifies physics and metaphysics with the Talmudic Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava, account of the beginning and account of the chariot, which together for him constitute what he calls Pardes, right? So paradise, another rabbinic term that Maimonides appropriates for his purposes. So if you want to be a perfect Jew, if you want to secure your spot in paradise, you have to intellectually love God through the study of physics and metaphysics. Now, how all-consuming this love must be, Maimonides stresses in the Book of Knowledge. I'm going to quote you a passage from the Laws Concerning Repentance. So he writes, "What is the appropriate love of God? It is to love God with a great and exceeding love, so strong that one's soul is tied up with God through love and always enraptured by it, like a lovesick person whose mind is never free from his love for a certain woman and who is always enraptured by it. Even greater than that should be the love of God in the hearts of those who love him." Now, of course, we cannot intellectually love God all the time. Right, you know the joke about the infatuated man who tells his beloved in the morning, "I cannot eat because I love you." At lunchtime, "I cannot eat because I love you." At dinner time, "I cannot eat because I love you." And at night, "I cannot sleep because I'm hungry." Right? At some point, the needs of the body catch up with us, so we have to do something about the needs of the body. So, we cannot properly focus on the study of mathematics, physics, and metaphysics if we are starving, if we are cold, if we are sick, and so on. So we have to take care of the body, and Maimonides is very much aware of that. So I quote another passage from the Book of Knowledge, from the Hilchot Yesodei Torah. He says, at the end of the first 4 chapters, he says, "I myself say that only he ought to stroll in Pardes, in paradise, study physics and metaphysics, whose stomach is filled with bread and meat." Bread and meat means knowing the explanation of the forbidden and the permitted and the like, and the rest of the commandments. So the great majority of the 613 commandments serve to regulate our embodied life, right? Eating, drinking, sex, and so on. But this is also part of philosophy as a way of life. For one thing, the commandments regulate our embodied life in a way that we can maximize the time and the focus on the study of the theoretical sciences. And I'll come back to this point shortly, right? So we should only eat and drink and have sex as much as is compatible with a life focused on study. For another thing, these commandments are grounded in the principles of political and practical and moral philosophy. Most prominently, of course, Aristotle's principle of the golden mean. So the commandments express these philosophical principles. In short, then, if Maimonides had his way, philosophy would pervade every aspect of our life. Now, I think I have another 40 minutes or so to go. So I will move now to what is perhaps the more interesting question, and Joel already alluded to it, not the historical question, does Maimonides consider philosophy as a way of life? I think the answer is of course, but the, if you wish, so existential question, can we still make a case for Maimonides' ideal of a philosophical life, a life centered on the intellectual love of God? In other words, should we become Maimonideans? Now, this concept of philosophy as a way of life, as you know, was coined by French historian of philosophy Pierre Hadot, who died in 2010. Ancient philosophy, Pierre Hadot argued, was very unlike its modern counterpart. It was not a theoretical discourse that specialists teach to specialists in the academic ivory tower. This is what we do today, according to Hadot. Specialists teach specialist in the academic ivory tower. But in ancient times, philosophy was a way of life, une manière de vivre, widely practiced by educated citizens in the Greco-Roman world. In the Middle Ages, Christianity took over philosophy's guiding role. It displaced philosophy, it demoted philosophy to theology's handmaid. But if philosophy was able to serve as guide before Christianity in the Greco-Roman world, why can it not resume this role for educated citizens in the modern world who have rejected Christianity? Right? Why can we not revive philosophy as a way of life? So Hadot's thesis comprises three main claims. First, the nature of ancient philosophy fundamentally differs from the nature of modern philosophy. Second, the ancient concept of philosophy as a way of life is superior to or more authentic than modern philosophy as a merely theoretical discourse. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we can revive this ancient concept of philosophy as a way of life by detaching its spirit from its outdated metaphysics and cosmology. We can bring it back to life, we can restore it. Now it's easy to see the attraction of Hadot's project, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could turn to philosophy as magistra vitae, as Cicero calls philosophy in the Tusculan Disputations, as a teacher of life who explains to us what a good, a happy, a flourishing life consists in, what Greek philosophers called eudaimonia, right? What this happy, flourishing life consists in, and gives us the tools to actually live such a life. Wouldn't it be wonderful if philosophy could accomplish this? Now, Hadot, as I mentioned, he blames the Middle Ages for the decline of philosophy as a way of life, but I think this part of his story is really the least convincing part. Many medieval philosophers were committed to philosophy as a way of life, and I'm happy to count Maimonides among these medieval philosophers who adopted philosophy as a way of life. And here again, I think one can readily see the attraction, perhaps especially for philosophically minded Orthodox Jews who hope to find in Maimonides not just a philosophical guide, but also one who shows how to integrate Jewish beliefs and practices into a philosophical life. Now, I think that Hadot's first claim about the difference between ancient and modern philosophy is, by and large, plausible. I think he's onto something there. I'm also willing to accept his second claim, with some reservations, that philosophy as a way of life is superior to, or at least more authentic than, philosophy as a merely theoretical discourse. I'm very skeptical, however, about his third claim, that we can detach the spirit of ancient and medieval philosophy from its outdated cosmology and metaphysics. Hadot, of course, acknowledges that we cannot be modern Platonists, Aristotelians, Stoics, Epicureans, and so on, if this requires us to believe in the demiurge of the Timaeus, in Aristotle's unmoved mover who turns the celestial spheres as a beloved, in the divine logos of the Stoics who orders the universe as a city for God and man, or in the randomly moving atoms of the Epicureans. But Hadot believes that we can somehow reinvent philosophy as a way of life, make it fit with the picture of the universe drawn by modern science and modern philosophy. And I personally don't see how that's possible. I think that philosophy as a way of life, at least in its Maimonidean form, cannot be more than an object of nostalgia. Now, the main catch of Maimonides' ideal is, I think, its metaphysical foundation, right? So why does Maimonides argue that we should perfect the mind through intellectually loving God? Because it brings us closest to God. Sure, that's the stripped down God of the philosophers, right? A pure mind that establishes the rational order of the universe, at least according to one prominent interpretation of Maimonides that goes back all the way to Samuel ibn Tibbon in the 13th century. Maimonides identifies the God of the philosophers with the God of the prophets. But I don't see how we can defend even this stripped down God of the philosophers. And if we cannot make a case for God, we of course cannot make a case for intellectually loving God or for becoming like God either. So this is the main claim that I'm going to present here today. I'll come back to it shortly, But before that, let me make a brief detour and explain why I actually deeply regret the loss of this concept of philosophy as a way of life. I don't believe in God, but I miss him. This is how the British writer Julian Barnes begins his memoir, Nothing to be Frightened of, published in 2008. And I feel the same about the God of the philosophers. I don't believe in him, but I miss him. And this for two reasons. First, as a tenured professor of philosophy and Jewish studies, I actually inhabit one of the few social spaces in a capitalist society in which it is actually possible to live a life focused on cultivating, on perfecting the mind, right? A kind of Maimonidean life. I think many of us who have the good fortune feel that we lived, a privileged life, a life that we would not want to exchange for another, and a life that we wish many more people could share. But unlike Maimonides, who could assert with confidence that a life devoted to perfecting the mind is objectively the best life, I fear that it may just be my idiosyncratic disposition that attracts me and scholars like me to this kind of life, just as other people are attracted to, I don't know, becoming soccer players or stockbrokers or medical doctors or fashion models and so on. Now, the reason why I wish I could make a stronger case for the excellence of this kind of life, a life devoted to perfecting the mind, is not just the childish desire to validate my own choice of life. I also think that this ideal of life has actually tremendous revolutionary potential, which leads me to the second reason why I regret its loss. Philosophers in the past, Karl Marx famously complained, interpreted the world in different ways, but they weren't keen on changing the world. I think that's nonsense. From Plato through the Middle Ages to Spinoza, many philosophers wanted to turn the world upside down and sought out political opportunities to do so. Maimonides, I think, is a paradigmatic example of this tradition, who as a leader of the medieval Jewish community actually tried to put this revolutionary program into practice. The best and most joyful life, these philosophers argue, is one in which we cultivate, in which we perfect the mind, rather than chasing after money, status, fame, pleasure, and so on. Social and educational institutions should be radically transformed to reflect this value, the value of focusing on the perfection of the mind. So far from merely contemplating things from their armchairs, these philosophers pushed for revolutionary change to promote contemplation. Now, true, in antiquity, this was an aristocratic ideal, with philosopher kings and natural slaves, right? So the many had to do the dirty work so that the few could enjoy the leisure that is needed to contemplate. But Maimonides, and that's very interesting, Maimonides actually wanted to democratize this ideal. As far as I can see, he's actually the only one from antiquity to the Middle Ages who proposed to replace the unappealing social hierarchy that we find in Plato and Aristotle with an egalitarian vision. Everyone, Maimonides says, should work a few hours of the day to help satisfy the needs of the body, bake bread, make shoes, see patients, build houses, and so on, and then devote the rest of the day to perfecting the mind. Let me quote a remarkable passage from the laws concerning Torah study in the Book of Knowledge. And note here the proportion of work time to study time in the example of the craftsman that Maimonides mentions in this passage. So I quote, "Every Israelite is under the obligation to study Torah, whether he's poor or rich, in sound health or ailing, in the vigor of youth or very old and feeble." Right? Every Israelite, without exception. The time assigned to study should be divided into 3 parts. 1/3 should be devoted to the written law, 1/3 to the oral law, and the last third to understanding and intellectually apprehending inferences, deducing one thing from another, and comparing one thing to another. This is called Talmud. For example, and now comes the example of the craftsman, if one is a craftsman who works in his trade 3 hours a day and devotes 9 hours to the study of the Torah, so 3 hours work, 9 hours study, he should spend 3 of these 9 hours in the study of the written law, 3 in the study of the oral law, and the remaining 3 in reflecting how to deduce one rule from another. The words of the prophets are contained in the written law and the interpretation in the oral law. The subject called pardes, paradise, that is the account of the beginning and the account of the chariot, physics and metaphysics, are included in the Gemara. This rule applies to the beginning of a person's studies, but once he makes progress in wisdom and no longer needs to learn the written law or be occupied with the oral law all the time, he should at fixed times read the written law and the oral law so as not to forget any of the rules of the law, and should devote all his days to the study of Talmud alone, according to his breadth of mind and maturity of intellect. So as we progress, we should gradually devote more time to the study of science and philosophy. Now, since Maimonides, we've become so much more productive, economically speaking productive, that already in 1930, the British economist John Maynard Keynes saw the 15-hour work week within our reach. Right? And he's echoing things that Karl Marx himself says in the German ideology about how technological and economic progress will gradually liberate us from the need to work. So thanks to automatization and washing machines, we could today all become philosopher kings. We all could live this kind of life. The leisure we need to cultivate the mind, which Plato and Aristotle considered an aristocratic privilege, could today be made available to everyone. We would need to make some fairly radical changes, work less, and trade off some of our wealth for free time, and turn education and culture into public goods available to everyone so that we can use the free time to perfect our mind. But if the political will were there, it would be feasible, right? So it's not an unrealistic and unfeasible utopia. Now note that unlike the scarce, the finite resources that we compete or go to war for, the perfection of the mind is never in short supply. Whether 10 people study geometry, biology, and metaphysics, or 10 billion, there will always be enough, right? You never have to scrimp on geometry. There's always enough. The same is true for Talmud Torah or for novels, art, and music, right? No matter how many people debate a Talmudic sugya, read Anna Karenina, or see a Rembrandt painting, they will not deplete those sources. Perfecting the mind does not require neglecting the needs of the body, food, shelter, healthcare, and so on. As I pointed out before, Maimonides actually thinks that satisfying the needs of the body is a necessary condition, right, for perfecting the mind. You cannot be hungry and study. The soul, he writes in Shmona Prakim, needs to find, I quote, its instruments healthy and sound, so its instruments are, of course, the body, in order that it can be directed towards the sciences and towards acquiring the moral and rational virtues, unquote. But if the central value of our life is perfecting the mind, we will only seek moderate amounts of these finite, of these scarce goods. That is, we will be willing to share these finite goods in a way that everyone's needs can be met, that everyone's needs can be satisfied. Now, this moderation is not like paying taxes, right, where you are actually forced to share. It does also not depend on altruism, where we share out of the goodness of our heart, but we would be moderate for purely egoistic reasons, because we would want to spend as little time as possible on making money and buying stuff, because our true passion lies elsewhere. Right? We want to not waste time on making money and buying stuff because we really want to go back to study. So it's easy to see why a society centered on the perfection of the mind, a community of contemplation, if you like, would not initiate wars over material resources, would not destroy nature for the sake of consumerism, or would not distribute goods unfairly. It would be a peaceful, sustainable, and just society. And there's one more important benefit. Perfecting the mind is a universal good, not a divisive one. 2 + 2 is 4, water freezes at 0 degrees, the earth turns around the sun, and so on, right? So grasping these truths does not depend on being a Jew or a Muslim, an Israeli, or a Palestinian, a woman or a man, black or white, straight or queer. As long as the truth is what you're after, you're welcome to the club. So giving up on philosophy as a way of life in this Maimonidean sense that I've sketched is tough. If we could make a convincing case for the value of perfecting the mind that does not depend on an outdated metaphysics, I think we would be able to tap into the most powerful revolutionary tradition championed in philosophy. So what is the problem with intellectually loving God? Why do I think that we cannot defend this ideal, or at least not on Maimonidean terms? So as I mentioned, intellectually loving God for Maimonides means grasping the whole of being through the study of the philosophical sciences. But we can only love something, desire something, if it is somehow good and beautiful, right? Why else would we desire it? Right? The thing has to have these features. It has to be good and beautiful in order to draw us towards it. Otherwise, we would not be attracted to it. And Maimonides indeed equates being and goodness. The distinction between facts and values, which has become a bedrock of modern philosophy after David Hume, does actually not exist for Maimonides. The whole of being is good because God has wisely ordered it. And the wise order is a teleological order. God orders the universe in view to maximizing its goodness. For Maimonides, this teleological order is not an anthropocentric order, right? So maximizing goodness does not mean, or is not the same as maximizing the goodness of humankind. It is for Maimonides based on the assumption that being is better than not being, existing is better than not existing, and that a maximally perfect world is one in which every possible thing, from the most perfect to the least perfect, has been realized. Maimonides draws this distinction explicitly in Guide 3, Chapter 25, where he laments, I quote, "The error of man about himself and his imagining that all that exists because of himself alone." Right? So this is anthropocentric teleology. And ignorance of what is primarily, what is really intended, namely the bringing into being of everything whose existence is possible, existence being indubitably a good. Yeah, this is the key phrase here. Existence is a good. End of quote. Now, we could perhaps call this a universal teleology, in contrast to an anthropocentric teleology, right? It is simply one version of what Arthur Lovejoy called the principle of plenitude. So consider mosquitoes, for example. They're arguably a nuisance for human beings, right? They bite, they transmit diseases, and so on. So proponents of anthropocentric teleology argue that God would not create mosquitoes unless they are a means to enhance human perfection. Proponents of universal teleology, by contrast, would argue that God must create mosquitoes if it is possible for mosquitoes to exist, regardless of whether they are useful for human beings or not, because existing as a mosquito is better than not existing at all. Hence, a universe without mosquitoes would be less perfect than a universe with mosquitoes. In this sense, one can say that the world that Maimonides' God creates is the best possible world. We can now see why the whole of being for Maimonides is something good, right? Why he equates being and goodness. But that does not yet quite explain why knowing the whole of being is good for us, right? Why this knowledge is something that we should actually desire. Now, the premise underlying the argument here is again the equation of being and goodness. Through knowledge we perfect our mind, and by perfecting our mind we maximize our being and hence also our goodness. We come as close as humanly possible to God, the divine mind, which is and knows all things in a completely unified way, of course, and thus has being and goodness to the highest degree. Now, more could, of course, be said about this picture that I've very briefly sketched here, but the main point that I'm trying to get across, that I'm trying to convey here, is that I think one cannot detach the ideal of the intellectual love of God from this picture that I have presented, from this metaphysical picture that I have presented. If we want to defend the ideal of a life centered on intellectually loving God, we need to defend the equation of being and goodness and the existence of a divine mind which teleologically orders nature. Now, could Spinoza perhaps help us to recover Maimonides' ideal? Spinoza agrees with Maimonides that we achieve human perfection through intellectually loving God, but his argument for this claim does not seem to depend on the concept of a wise God who teleologically orders the universe. Now, both Professor Harvey and I have argued that Spinoza is often closer to Maimonides than other scholars allow, and I think this is also true in this case, but I'm not sure that in this case it's actually a good thing that Spinoza is so close to Maimonides. I think it makes his case less attractive. Like Maimonides, Spinoza clearly equates being and goodness. Being is better than not being. As he writes in the short treatise on God, man, and man's well-being, I quote, "It is a perfection to exist and to have been produced by God, while the greatest imperfection of all is not being." Right? So it's a perfection to exist. The greatest imperfection of all is not to exist. Being, power, and virtue mean the same thing for Spinoza. The more being and power a thing has, the greater its virtue and perfection. This equation underlies Spinoza's Conatus doctrine, right, which is for him the most fundamental law of nature. So according to the Conatus, the essence of all things is a strive, the desire to preserve themselves, to preserve their being. But why would things do everything in their power to preserve themselves, to stick around, unless to exist, to be, is a good thing, right? Now, the power of Spinoza's God is absolutely infinite, and there's neither an internal nor an external reason or cause that prevents him from using this power. Now, given that existence is good for Spinoza, God must, as a consequence, bring every conceivable thing into existence. I quote, that's from the Ethics, Proposition 16, "From the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinite things in infinite ways, or all things that can fall under the infinite intellect." So all conceivable things have to be created, have to follow from the necessity of the divine nature. So like Maimonides, Spinoza is committed to a version of the principle of plenitude. God causes all conceivable things, ranging from the most powerful God himself, who is causa sui, who is the cause of himself, all the way down to the least powerful modifications of his essence, right? Mosquitoes, snowflakes, although coming from Canada, I can say that the Conatus of snowflakes is much more powerful than I sometimes wish, so they can stick around for a frustratingly long time. But, you know, so all the way from God to the smallest and most transient things, God has to cause everything. Now, Spinoza's concept of God's causal agency is, of course, emphatically non-anthropomorphic, right? So he doesn't think that God causes things like human beings cause things. God does not act on the basis of deliberation and choice, but he acts from the necessity of his nature. And the perfection of God's effects, the perfection of the universe, is emphatically non-anthropocentric, as Spinoza stresses in his reply to the question why God created things that from a human perspective appear as evil or imperfections. I quote, this is from the appendix to Ethics Part 1. "I answer only because God did not lack material to create all things, from the highest degree of perfection to the lowest. Or to speak more properly, because the laws of his nature have been so ample that they suffice for producing all things which can be conceived by an infinite intellect." Still, Spinoza, like Maimonides, is clearly committed to a version of what I called universal teleology. Right? Also for Spinoza, we live in this sense in the best possible world, a maximally perfect world, in the sense that every level of perfection has been realized in it. The equation of being and goodness also underlies Spinoza's concept of intellectually loving God. So now I come back to this contemplative ideal. So we maximize our being, our human being and power, that is, we come closest to God, whose being and power are absolutely infinite, by adequately causing as many effects as we can. The more effects follow exclusively from our nature, the greater our power for Spinoza. And insofar as we are minds, insofar as we are thinking things, being the adequate cause of effects means forming adequate ideas, which basically means acquiring true knowledge of the universe derived from God, the first cause of all things. Since increases in power for Spinoza are experienced as joy, and since we perceive God as a cause of that joy, our love for God grows in proportion to our knowledge. Now, the more we perfect our intellect through knowledge, the greater our love for God is going to be. Now, we don't need to delve into the details of Spinoza's argument here. It's complicated and sometimes a bit technical. But the point that I'm trying to make is simply that Spinoza's argument for the intellectual love of God depends on metaphysical assumptions that he in part shares with Maimonides, and that are in any case, I think, not easier to defend than the metaphysical assumptions that underlie Maimonides' argument. So I think in both cases, in the case of Maimonides and in the case of Spinoza, it's going to be an uphill battle to defend this concept of the intellectual love of God. But did I perhaps misrepresent what philosophy as a way of life means for Maimonides? This, I think, would be Joseph Stern's objection to what I've said here, who in his 2013 book, The Matter and Form of Maimonides Guide, argued that Maimonides was a kind of Pyrrhonian skeptic who did not believe that we can actually attain intellectual perfection at all. Maimonides' goal is to show us the limitations of human knowledge and to lead us to the kind of peace of mind that comes from suspending judgment, recognizing that we cannot answer the big and anxiety-provoking questions about God, the world, and the human good, and so on. At the same time, Professor Stern argues, intellectual perfection remains something like a regulative ideal for Maimonides. Once we have acquired the appropriate epistemic humility, we should still puzzle about these unanswerable metaphysical questions, because the fun and perfection lies in the process of inquiry rather than the outcome. Now, I don't want to examine here whether Professor Stern's interpretation of Maimonides is compelling or not. I think it's a very interesting, a very fertile interpretation. But assuming that it is correct, I still wonder whether it actually offers us a defensible Maimonidean concept of philosophy as a way of life. Right? So it's a different thing to offer a compelling interpretation of Maimonides and to actually offer the Maimonidean concept of philosophy of life that we can defend, that we can adopt. It's not clear to me that even if in this more modest form, as a regulative ideal, intellectual perfection has intrinsic value. Why should we struggle with unanswerable metaphysical questions, let alone make this sort of struggle the central value of our life? And conversely, why should we be skeptics? We would need to come up with new arguments for skepticism that are not dependent on the outdated cosmological and metaphysical views that Maimonides himself held and possibly motivated Maimonides' skepticism. Now, let me end by returning to the intellectual love of God. So for Maimonides, as we saw, it refers to the quest for knowledge of the whole of being, which he argues constitutes our ultimate end, right, the human good. Of course, our picture of the whole of being, our picture of the universe, has significantly changed since Maimonides' time. 2 years ago, when my daughter turned 7, we took her and her friends to a planetarium in Montreal, and they were happily nibbling on their popcorn while the moderator explained the size, the age, and the composition of the universe. Then the moderator said something about a sense of wonder that this picture evokes. Now, whatever wonder this picture of the universe may inspire, it is very different from the divinely crafted natural order that ancient and medieval philosophers, Aristotle and Maimonides, admired. How does God move the celestial spheres, Aristotle pondered. If he's pure mind, he has no arms to push or to pull. God moves them as a beloved, hos eroton in Greek, moves them as a beloved, he concludes in book 12 of the Metaphysics in what I think is the most poetic passage of his writings. So eternal circular motion is how the celestial spheres express their love of God, and they're a model for us, right? They're a model for human beings. If we could, we should also turn eternally and express our love for God in this way. Now, surely no physicist today would claim that the desire to imitate God determines the structure of the universe. Nietzsche's parable of the madman and the gay science, I think, captures this shift nicely. Where has God gone? The madman cried. I quote, where has God gone? The madman cried. I'll tell you where. We killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How could we have drunk up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to erase a whole horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Now where is it going? Where are we moving? Away from all suns? Aren't we falling constantly? Backwards, sideways, forwards in every direction? Is there still an above and below? Aren't we wandering as if through an endless nothing? Isn't empty space breathing upon us? Hasn't it gotten colder? Isn't night and more night continuously coming upon us? End of quote. Now, I think the Copernican revolution played a big part in this rupture that becomes visible in this text from Nietzsche, but I don't think it affected this rupture on its own. There were other discoveries that added pressure on the ancient and medieval picture of the universe, most importantly, the central role that randomness came to play in biology through the theory of evolution and in physics through the theory of quantum mechanics. But we don't need to fill in all the details here to agree that the picture that contemporary scientists and philosophers draw of the universe is not the picture of a good, beautiful, teleologically ordered universe. It's a picture, I think, of a universe devoid of metaphysical meaning and purpose, not a universe chiseled by a divine mind. But don't we still greatly value knowledge, truth, and science? Of course we do. But we do so for different reasons than Maimonides. For Maimonides, knowledge is good in itself, right? It's intrinsically good. It is knowledge of the causal order of nature that manifests God's wisdom, and it constitutes our perfection, our happiness, our likeness to God. So it's an intrinsic good. Today, we only value knowledge as a means. The better we understand nature, the better we can control it, which in turn translates into improved health, new technologies, better social policies, and so on. But the Maimonidean ideal of a community united by the intellectual love of God cannot be grounded on the merely instrumental value of knowledge. If knowledge of the whole of being, of the universe, does not perfect us and fill us with joy, we will not be drawn to it, at least not for its own sake. Right? Why should love drive us to study a universe that burst into existence 13 billion years ago, where we spend a few years framed by infinite non-existence on a small planet in one of billions of galaxies, governed by blind natural forces that led up to us via the primordial soup, amoeba, apes, and all the chance encounters of our ancestors? Would we not be better off sticking our heads back into the sand and just going on with our day-to-day lives? Now, I wish I could end on a more cheerful note. I really think that Maimonides is a paradigmatic proponent of philosophy as a way of life, and the egalitarian twist that he gives to this ideal of a community united by contemplation, I think, makes his proposal uniquely attractive. Right? I think there's really great attraction in this. Still, unless we can plausibly argue that the whole of being is ordered by God, and that the intellectual love of God, that is knowledge of the whole of being through the study of physics and metaphysics, constitutes human perfection, constitutes human happiness, I think that this form of a philosophical life is not available to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fraenkel. I can't help take the chairman's privilege here and just point to what strikes me as an important connection between Professor Fraenkel's paper and Dr. Feigenblatt's paper from yesterday. If he spoke yesterday about the necessity faith in the absence of metaphysics, but the difficulty in acquiring it. And here Professor Fraenkel is talking about the necessity of a teleological ground almost for the philosophical life in the absence of a teleology in nature. And that really, I think, both of those papers directly talk to the challenges we face as contemporary readers of Maimonides, trying to find real meaning and purpose both in our own lives and in teaching. And now for a more formal and thought-out response from Professor Menachem Lorberbaum, who's also interested in limitations. He began his career working on Maimonides and Nissim Gerandi on the limits of law and the necessity of a larger philosophical vision and purpose for Jewish life, and has continued in the course of his career to expand that, particularly in the work of the Jewish Political Tradition series, the 3 volumes that have really argued that that Jewish life against a kind of what Heschel called pan-halachism. The answers cannot simply be located in obedience to the narrow law, but they have to be informed by a larger vision of the good, and ultimately that has to come from a broader reflection and not just from obedience. And I think that really leads into the questions that that this panel is speaking of.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Carlos, for that wonderful paper. What can I do in the quarter of an hour that I have to react? Even 25 minutes. I'm going to give an alternative vision of how I think we might approach Maimonides, and perhaps a different kind of philosophical posture than the one that was so richly portrayed right now. Rather, I would argue, than an espousal of the philosophical life, I see Maimonides as advocating a philosophically minded and philosophically aware theological commitment. This is concomitant to a theological posture that views theology as providing a thorough critique of metaphysics, or conversely, a radical metaphysic. However, it is a path that can only be pursued by a thorough philosophical training. And I think that on that reading, that explains why Maimonides is open to very different sorts of reading depending on how you put together the Maimonidean puzzle and the different elements in it. Hence, it is my position that not natural theology is the heart of Maimonidean thought, but a negative theology that thinks God otherwise than being. Natural theology is the highest form of political theology. It is not patently false, say like corporal religious language, but it is world-oriented rather than God-oriented. This is precisely the difference between Hilchot Yesodei Torah and the Guide of the Perplexed. So my reading, the structure that is provided of the universe and its relation to God in the opening of Sefer HaMaddah and Hilchot Yesodei Torah is in fact Maimonides' political theology, and I think that the guide is providing us with something completely different. Now, I want to highlight 3 points that would explain why, or give a better account of this kind of posture. The first has to do with understanding what the Guide of the Perplexed is about. How do we read the Guide of the Perplexed as a book? Now, you can say that in an important sense it may not be a book, in the sense that it may not have that kind of thematic unity of an ongoing argument and a single commitment. This is a major position in reading the guide. I see the guide differently. My point of departure is that for me the crucial tension in the book is between a concept of knowing about God, which is extremely thin. It's actually thinned out to nil in the book. On the other hand, the book has a very powerful, and I would argue compelling, vision of knowing God. So the distinction is between knowing that God is such and knowing God. And the high moment of knowing God, although by no means a singular one in the guide, is that we find in part 3, chapter 51, which is also the most Sufi-oriented moment in the book. And another way of putting the argument that I'm arguing against Carlos is to say that I read Maimonides as a Sufi and not as a philosopher. Now, what does this mean? I think that Maimonides' vision of knowing God also inspires a very powerful ethos that I will speak about in a moment. But first, what is the import of the negative theology as I understand it, which is at the heart of the theological chapters of part 1? Using Heideggerian language, I would say that the big moment or the important moment of negative theology is bringing us to think beyond an ontotheological model. That is, rather than, or let me illustrate that in a paradox. Maimonides argues that there is a good argument for the existence of God. But when we think about arguments of the existence of God, we're faced with an interesting paradox. People who don't believe in God will not be convinced by these arguments, and people that do believe in God don't need these arguments. So what is its function? Its important function is to say that I can't think about the world without God. It's expressing in what sense must I think about God when I think about the world. However, for Maimonides, what happens interestingly is that after arguing that there is a valid argument for the existence of God, he says it can tell us nothing about God. So the argument doesn't equip us with anything. Now this is exactly not the posture of the laws of Ilchot Yesodei HaTorah. Ilchot Yesodei HaTorah is a strong statement that God makes our world understandable. The negative theology would say that even if that was the case, it tells us nothing about God. It doesn't orientate us towards God. It's for that reason that I actually understand Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah as Maimonides' political theology, and not the place to go and look for where his more where his theological commitments lie. The negative theology portrays, rather than a knowledge of God, a mode of intending towards God, of facing God, of God in all his otherness, and inspires, I would argue, a very particular form of passion towards God. And this leads to the ethical posture that I think is informing Maimonides' theology. And it's the one that you find in chapter 5 of the 8 chapters, or you find in part 3, chapter 51. And that is the argument that for a person who is trying to achieve knowing God, the posture of being God-oriented is a love of God that is an all-consuming passion toward that which can never be attained as fixed. It is an intellectually informed passion, but not an intellectual passion in the precise sense. Now, if you look at Maimonides this way, then Maimonides is dramatically breaking with the neo-Aristotelian medieval tradition of the philosophical life. But his form of theological commitment can't be achieved without appreciating that project. Because it's only by knowing the world that we shed the world towards God. And that I take to be the ethical point of the chapters on the negative theology. I would go along with Carlos's saying that we can use Hadot very interestingly by understanding that what happens in chapters 55, 56, 57, 58 of part 1 is that by understanding what the world is, we understand its irrelevance to the divine otherness. We slowly shed the world as an intellectual concept. It's that relativization that enables theological posturing, because the only meaning we can give to divine otherness is that God is not the world and the world is not God. But to be able to make that statement responsibly. Because as soon as we don't make that statement responsibly, as Maimonides says in part 3, chapter 51, what we are worshiping is not God, but a figment of our imagination. So this I take to be a very complex form of worship. It's very different from the kind of concept of negative theology that's structured in Neoplatonic thought. And hence, also, for example, very, very different from what you'll find in people like Derrida or in Jean-Luc Marion, who are adopting a very different model, one that's very close to that tradition. Maimonides is much more radical in what he's saying. And if I'm correct, then what happens is that the political project is not one in which one can, it's not the arena for human perfection, and it cannot be. Now, I just want to leave one point where I think that in regard to the problems of modernity that you raised at the end of your lecture, why I think Maimonides on this reading might be a compelling model. And that is because although I think that when you read the last halakha of the Mishnah Torah that you alluded to, this idea that the meaning of the messianic moment is one of an affluent society that will enable people the leisure to be committed to wisdom, I think with or in spite of the sublimity of that moment, and that no one in the Jewish tradition said something like that before Maimonides, and many people feel very uneasy in reading it because triumphalism is much more important in this tradition, or has been at least. Yet, what Maimonides did not take into consideration is that and could not, is that the affluent society creates ennui. It creates boredom and bored people. And that the deep question of the possibility of an engaged religious life today is the question of what might an impassioned religious and philosophical life look like? In a world in which passion has dramatically withered away, and in which love is only with great effort differentiated from sexuality. Thank you.